For me, one of the best aspects of indie games is the fact that they capture the essence of many of the retro titles that I grew up loving. While the RPGs of the indie scene can take on many different forms, I really love the retro JRPGs. While the interest in such games is strong, and there are indies in that style like Sea of Stars and Chained Echoes, there's also many indie JRPGs that get overlooked, even though they might provide an experience that will satisfy fans of the genre. To bring more attention to some deserving games, here is a list of 10 lesser-known indie JRPGs that are well worth your time. Before that, why not shine a light on our Patreon over at patreon.com/idreamofindiegames. You'll gain Discord access, early ad-free versions of our shows, shoutouts at the end of every single video, a brand new podcast, and so much more. Your community is waiting for you. When looking for an example of how an indie JRPG can capture everything that made 16-bit JRPGs great while modernizing the style with quality of life features, Ara Fell is an excellent choice. Within this game, you will find an interesting story, memorable characters, entertaining writing, fun and engaging combat, great exploration with interactive environments, and a ton of accessibility options that modern players will certainly enjoy. Developed by Stegosoft Games and released in 2016, Ara Fell is only now starting to get the attention it deserves. Fortunately, it's pretty easy to find and purchase this one because it is available digitally on Windows, Mac OS, Linux, PS4, Xbox One and Series, Nintendo Switch, Android, and iOS. Ara Fell was also included in a physical combo release with Rise of the Third Power, which is an outstanding Stegosoft game. That was put on the PS4 and the Nintendo Switch by Limited Run. As of the time of this writing, Video Games Plus still has copies of both of these versions for an affordable price. Ara Fell is well worth your time and money. Up next we have Siralim Ultimate, which is a monster collecting JRPG, and it gets a lot of its influences from games like Dragon Quest Monsters and the Shin Megami Tensei series. Players will have the ability to summon monsters, increase their abilities through various means, and even be able to fuse two monsters together to create hybrids. There's a heavy emphasis on both the combat and the dungeon crawling here, and while the game is fairly challenging, there's also easier difficulty options available for those who would prefer them. As for the appearance of the game itself, some players might be turned off a little bit if they're not used to this style. It's very early 90s CRPG, has an overhead view, and then the combat portions kind of look more like a 16-bit console JRPG. While this does give it a dated look overall, it does have some nostalgic charm to it. And hey, if you end up enjoying Siralim Ultimate, there is the rest of the series for you to check out, so be sure to do so. This one's available for Windows, Mac, Linux, PS4, Xbox One, Switch, Android, and iOS. Next, we have a strategy JRPG that released in late 2022, but unfortunately never seemed to gain much attention. Developed by B-Train Studio, Grey Heritage Faded Vision is a game that wears its main influence proudly on its sleeve, and that influence is retro Fire Emblem games. While it retains a lot of the structure and look of those earlier titles, it's also more forgiving, like some of the more recent games in the series, and doesn't have permadeath. The experience is pretty short, but sweet, with the game's campaign being about 9 to 10 hours. Even while this is an obvious love letter to another series, such an approach can definitely be a positive thing. While its look and gameplay mechanics are clearly adopted from Fire Emblem, Grey Heritage still has a charm of its own that's unique in a similar way to a well-done cover song that pays proper homage to the original while still sounding recognizably distinct from it. The game is available digitally on Steam. Developed by Something Classic Games and released in 2017, next we have Shadows of Adam, an indie JRPG that recreates the style of SNES JRPGs while adding a slight modern spin on the battle mechanics. Taking influence from the Lufia and Final Fantasy games of the 16-bit era, it has tasteful choices in its inspirations as well as in its individual execution. The combat system feels a little bit more modern compared to classic games as well. There's a heavy emphasis on resource management, pooling your points to perform certain skills, all that kind of stuff. But overall, Shadows of Adam manages to feel pretty retro and modern at the same time. If you're up for a unique combination of old and new, then I highly recommend this one. You can grab the game for yourself digitally for Windows, Mac, Linux, and Switch. Moving on to number 6, it's The Amber Throne, and this one will stand out on the list as being the most visually impressive game with its hand-drawn style It'll also probably come as a surprise that this was made in RPG Maker. Developed by Joshua Missile and released in 2015, it isn't all that well known outside of the RPG Maker community, which is why it's on this list. While there are some areas that feel a little bit rough with this one, including the controls and a script that could have used more editing, that doesn't really come close to ruining the experience as a whole. It is still fun to play, and even though the storytelling and dialogue itself could use that brushing up, it is fairly easy to still become invested in the characters. The Amber Throne is available digitally on Steam. Now for something on the more strange side of things, Jimmy and the Pulsating Mass. This one takes a lot of design elements from 16-bit JRPGs like Earthbound and Paladin's Quest, but puts them in a very bizarre, horrific context. Really crazy here is the fact that Jimmy has this magical ability which allows him to understand defeated enemies and then be able to use their powers. While I'm a huge fan of both Earthbound and indie RPGs, I have to be honest here in that most Earthbound-inspired indies kind of fall flat for me because they don't have that same dynamic of awkward and potentially dangerous strangeness between the characters and the world surrounding them. As cute and quirky as Earthbound could be, there was also an aspect of something sinister happening in the game, and Jimmy and the Pulsating Mass not only successfully recreates that feeling, but turns it up to 11, and the result is a very compelling game that you should own digitally on Steam if it sounds up your alley. Here we have an older RPG Maker game created by a single man going by the name of Tempura, and it was originally released in 2004 with a director's cut seeing light in 2006. It was a landmark game in the old Japanese RPG Maker community because it stood out from the rest of the games at that time for the quality of its gameplay, and it was also eventually translated into English with the permission of Tempura. The game itself is kind of eccentric in that it mixes pixel art with scanned hand-drawn art and digitized images, but it's something that doesn't take all that long to get used to, and it's a really cool effect. The look of the pixel art combined with the soundtrack makes it feel like it's something that could easily have been a PC Engine Super CD-ROM game, and it reminds me a bit of the Cosmic Fantasy series in that way. While Seraphic Blue is a bit more rough around the edges than the others on this list, I think it's still worth playing for those who can look past that. The quality of the hand-drawn art can vary a lot, but some of the design work is actually quite good at times, especially when it comes to the bosses. Seraphic Blue is a game that has never had a commercial release, so it sadly can't be purchased. However, it is available completely free and totally legally for download from various sites hosting RPG Maker games, so this is one you can try even if you're broke and guilt-free. Alright, onward with another 2022 release. This is For a Vast Future. The game takes place in a modern dystopian setting set in the aftermath of a war. One of the unique features is that instead of obtaining currency, players will find scraps of loot from battles that can be used to craft items. While the battle system is based upon the use of guns and items, there is a system in which certain kinds of ammunition and other items can do elemental damage and cause status effects in similar ways to a magic system you would find in a more traditional fantasy-themed RPG. The Game Boy aesthetic works pretty well here, and it feels as if it would have been one of the better RPGs on that system if it had released during that time. With a playtime running somewhere between 5 and 10 hours, depending on how much you choose to do, it's a short and sweet experience that would also fit well into playing in a handheld format, so that makes it a nice fit for the Nintendo Switch or your Steam Deck, as it's also available digitally on Steam. Moving right along, a sadly overlooked release from earlier this year is Demon Lord Reincarnation. Developed by Grave Robber Foundation, this is a first-person dungeon crawling JRPG that also takes some influence from Western dungeon crawlers. Players must assemble a party of 4 characters with different class types, and the characters you choose are largely portrayed in an anime style. This is also one of the more difficult types of dungeon crawlers that has a character permadeath, so balancing your HP, the amount of fights you take part in, and finding rest areas are going to be crucial to your success. The presentation is a minimalistic monochromatic style, and that adds a certain charm to the party members and the enemy portraits. Music-wise, the tone alternates between moody dungeon synth while exploring and more energetic but still somewhat sinister tracks for battles that sound like they would be right at home in one of the 16-bit Shin Megami Tensei games. This mix of audio and visual elements gives the game an atmosphere that makes it easy to get sucked into. Demon Lord Reincarnation is a minimalistic but mighty game that I recommend to those of you who are up for the challenge. It's available digitally from Steam and Good Old Games. Hey, you made it to the end of this list, congratulations, and we hope you've discovered a JRPG that you've perhaps never heard of. But finally, we have Frail Hearts, an indie horror JRPG from 2022. It's a tale of supernatural horror and human desperation told in the form of a game that mixes RPG and visual novel elements. The game has 4 protagonists who are previously unknown to each other, who each have brushes with a supernatural threat and are then brought together to fight a greater threat. Each protagonist is dealing with their own internal demons while also facing an external demonic threat, and they are vulnerable to succumbing to either of these. The gameplay is more heavily geared towards the story than it is the combat, though of course the combat does play a crucial role still. Learning and exploiting enemy weaknesses is the key to success. The ways to power up your characters are to obtain cravings, which you get from battles instead of experience points, which can then be used at the altar of sacrifice to enhance stats or upgrade abilities, or in rewards you get from completing side quests. The mix of visual novel and JRPG combat elements is pretty interesting here, and while it can seem a little bit unbalanced at times, it's still a good one overall. Frail Hearts provides a very unique playing experience, and it's available digitally on Steam. So with all of that said, what are some indie JRPGs that you think deserve more attention? Have you played any of these releases? Please let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you, and thank you so much. Please feel free to like and subscribe if you enjoy independent content, and patreon.com/idreamofindiegames will give you access to our Discord community, as well as shoutouts at the end of every single video we produce, and so much more. We can't wait to meet you, and I will see you on the channel.